We're not having a break, we're starting another panel. This is not a break, it's starting another panel.
I get to introduce the moderator. Let's see. I have it elsewhere. This was a... Geez. Those are really on. The panel was finalized yesterday, and I hadn't been able to talk to everybody that was on it, but I think Craig Kundrat did. Let's see. You know, I don't have the... whoever's got the answer. Okay, and Craig wrote to these people, so I'm hoping Craig will come up here quickly. I didn't see the answers from everybody, so I don't know for sure. Ah, Dr. Kundrat. Did you get answers from everybody here so far? I know you've been stumping to, okay. So I'm going to vary because of time, because we need to be, we're a half hour behind and we need to be wrapped up with the noon speaker, is that correct?
About 12, we can go to a little
Okay. All right, we will do that, so I'm going to keep... Will the panel members for the one-year flight please come on up to the podium? We'll do this very trim. Was the speaker at lunchtime to start at noon or noon 30?
Well, we'll get everyone to get through the line and then we'll start speaking.
Okay, all right, so we'll keep this real snappy. Okay. A short discussion about long flights.
A couple years ago, we discussed, maybe a year and a half ago, we discussed whether we need 1 year flight.
Right. Now they're talking. Yep. From you probably have more intelligence than I do, but from what I understand, they're discussing a total of 12 one-year flight experiences, so 6 flights of 2 people. The first of which starts next year. So I think that may be the framework that Dr. Kundrat goes on, and whether that's useful from a science standpoint or what does it buy you that the shorter missions don't. So that'll be part of the discussion. But we have to be finished by noon, so...
yeah, I see that's something delicious already on the table.
Yeah, and I guarantee you that will be a big... I mean, you guys will be stars, but yeah, there will be a rush there. So I think you're number 5. Graham. And again, if we could have the one-year panel members please come up to the podium. think Craig may, if you don't need that, Craig may need, if you don't need this, Craig might need it, and we'll hand it right back to you very quickly. Linda, we'll give it right back to you as soon as we get it. Yeah, no. It's great. Right. Okay. Craig, you ready to go? All right. Okay, we'd like to go ahead and get started if we could. And good morning. My name is Michael Barrett from the astronaut office and formerly from the space life sciences world. It's actually quite an honor to even introduce the moderator for this panel of august speakers. I'm going to keep this very short because we have a noon cutoff to be sure that we have time for our 12 o'clock speaker. The topic of this panel is follow-on one-year missions. Probably you're aware that we do have a one-year mission starting in March of next year. And there have been 4 one-year missions in the past on our Russian colleague side, and that experience is there. But I think it's safe to say we've made some pretty significant advances in habitability and understanding of human physiology since then. So it's time. It's time to. Извините, Инесса Бенедиктовна. Все нормально? Okay. Sergey is very qualified to help. It's time for us to look at the human experience and time durations in weightlessness commensurate with our deep space exploration missions that we have planned in the near term. So I am happy to introduce Dr. Craig Kundrat to moderate this panel. Craig is the deputy scientist, the deputy chief scientist for NASA's Human Research Program, and has been so since 2007. And he has the job of helping to identify the gaps in our knowledge that feed our human risks to spaceflight, and he has done that in a very diplomatic and wise fashion again since 2007. He also describes himself as an erstwhile crystallographer with 0 time in space, but capable of finding space on a dark night. So on most dark nights. So with that, Dr. Craig Kundrat. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Barrett. It's a pleasure and an honor to facilitate such an esteemed panel with decades of spaceflight experience, supporting spaceflight, and years of spaceflight actual experience. I had thought, this being a one-year mission panel, being twice the normal ISS increment, we would be allowed to have a 2.5-hour panel, twice as long as the normal panel, but instead we're about half as long. So. Panel members, since we do have a noon cutoff, if we can shoot for about 4 minutes for our presentation to leave a little bit of time for questions from the audience, that would be great if we can do that. So our panel, you've already met Dr. Valery Bogomolov, Deputy Director at IBMP, decades of experience working the medical operations side of spaceflight. He also chairs international bodies that have to do with medical operations and research. Dr. David Ginges is Vice Chair of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine. He has over 30 years of award-winning research in neurobehavioral effects of fatigue and stress. Mr. Bill Gerstenmaier is the Associate Administrator of NASA's Human Exploration and Operations Directorate. So if it has anything to do with human spaceflight, it comes through Mr. Gerstenmaier's office. That's ISS, Space Launch System, Orion, commercial programs, you name it. Dr. Inessa Kozlovskaya is the head of the Neurophysiology and Countermeasures Department at the IBMP, and she brings decades of insight, having studied spaceflight effects and countermeasure methods. Mr. Sergey Krikalev is a renowned cosmonaut record holder with over 803 days in spaceflight. On many different platforms, Soyuz, Shuttle, Mir, Station. Next to him, Dr. Graham Scott is the Vice President of the National Science Biomedical Research Institute. And he's one of the scientists who participated in the sequencing of the human genome. And you'll hear a little bit more about omics from him in a moment. And Colonel Vladimir Titov is one of the gentlemen who had the very first one-year mission and a record-setting event on the Mir space station. So they'll be bringing their unique insights into this panel. And just to set the stage a little bit, in case you don't know exactly where things lie, there is a one-year mission planned for launch just 9 months from now in March of 2015. Back in November 2012, Mikhail Kornienko and Scott Kelly were named to be the crew for that one-year mission, the two individuals that will be for 1 year on the International Space Station. They're in the midst of training. The science is defined. And this is certainly the first one-year mission, but it's triggered from the science side a lot of thought about the utility, the usefulness of subsequent one-year missions. And so just to set a little bit of context here, I want to share some thinking from NASA's Human Research Program. This has been led by our chief scientist, Mark Shellhammer. Just to give you a flavor of why there might be compelling scientific reasons to do further one-year missions in a systematic fashion. 3 types of things that we are interested in is understanding the time dependence of various risks, like, just to pick one example, the visual impairment issue. We don't have any idea about how it might progress past 6 months going on to 12 months. There's a lot of questions in that area. There's another area where there may be threshold effects, that you see very little response until some accumulation of stressor or what have you. So an example of that would be the immune system, where we see a lot of changes in the immune system, but not great dysfunction or inability to respond to challenges. But what happens after 12 months of this? It often takes, for example, a long time for allergies to develop into an acute form. And the third area is verifying countermeasures that we think are effective right now. So there's been a lot of great work done on bone and muscle and cardiovascular countermeasures. And so a question is, will those really hold up for longer durations than 6 months? So especially in that latter category, if you're looking at the effectiveness of these countermeasures, you would like to have more than just 2 individuals and be able to make some statistical measures. So the general thinking is that it would be nice to have an additional 5 or 6 one-year missions spaced approximately a year apart, so that there could be about 10 subjects for these types of investigations. So that's not been decided at all yet, but that's some of the leading thinking about going beyond this current one-year mission that we're planning for. So that's just a NASA human research perspective. Okay, so let's go on to our panel then, and let's begin with the gentleman who first spent a year in space on Mir, and Dr. Titov, or Colonel Titov. Could you please comment on any aspect of the one-year mission, but in particular, if you could, comments on your experience on your one-year mission, and any speculation you may have to offer on how you think it might be different in the era of the International Space Station.
Спасибо.
Thank you for this opportunity. I will say a few words about my mission. It started on the 21st of December of '87 and ended on the 21st of December '88. In December last year, we gathered all the crews at the Cosmonautics Museum in Moscow. We wanted to talk about it like for 30 or 40 minutes, and we ended up talking for 2.5 hours. This is a very interesting subject, and a lot of us had something to say. The flight started nominally. We had no failures in the docking system or propulsion system. We started working on the station as planned. We handed over, and what we have done within a year, we accepted 3 visiting crews during 1 year. 5 cargo vehicles came our way. We had 3 EVAs. 2 of them were not planned. those were maintenance, emergency EVAs. And during that 1 year, we had 1,500 some payload experiments. I would not be talking exactly what was done automatically, what was the crew involved in as to science payloads. But since we don't have much time, what can I say about now what can be recommended to the next cruise? When the crew begins training for such long duration mission, of course, it is quite clear that the trainers are teaching the crew as much as possible how to use the facilities on board. The medical support is going to be well done. We are sure of that. We have good experience in supporting physical status of the crew. Psychological training probably can be modified. Maybe we don't know everything about that yet. Of course, motivation for the crew should be great if they are going to fly for 1 year. My motivation was that we did not have docking because there was a failure. Then we had a rocket that failed, and that was a third, maybe last attempt of our program, the last chance for me to fly. And when I was offered to participate in a 1 year mission, I had no questions. I had 100% motivation. That's why the whole mission was fine for me. I was not disturbed by anything, by any difficulties. No off nominals. Even when I was just doing really great, I was not bored with that at all. Everything went well. That's why for the new crews that are going to be trained and that are being trained now, such psychological motivation is very important, and it starts from the beginning of training. The person already knows that he's going to be there for such a long time, and here the whole personnel, training personnel, psychologists and doctors need to know exactly what the person is capable of.
It's likely that today, I mean, it's been 25 years since, we have different approaches to provide psychological and medical support for the crew in flight. I know that there are a lot of systems that were updated. I know that nutrition and exercise protocols have changed. Back when we flew missions for the USSR, we pursued one goal of extending our missions from a month to 5 months to 6 months. When we handed over Yuri Romanenko, he has already been there 327 days as Inessa Benedictovna's prompting. So we already had some experience, and we were following what has been already planned. So when we arrived in space, we were pretty fit. We were able to adapt quickly. In terms of the after effects, we still have them. I have pretty high hemoglobin levels. Not sure why. These are the questions for the experts, and I'm sure that there are other effects as well. And it's something that we need to study more closely. Stand by one, please. Of course, a human will be impacted by a long-duration flight. There will be systematic changes, be it a change in the bone tissue, muscle tissue, locomotive system, and so forth. In terms of countermeasures, I'm sure you're much more familiar with what we already have than I am. I don't think I need to go too much more in depth on the subject. Just wanted to say that we really need to know why we're trying to increase the mission duration. What is our end goal? If we're pursuing the same plan that was outlined a while back, and that's the plan or the goal of interplanetary flights, specifically a mission to Mars, then yes, we definitely have a justification for increasing our mission durations now. What can I recommend for the new crews? I can say that myself and my colleagues who's also been in space for a year, we are available. If you have any questions, we'll be happy to answer them. If there are some practical issues that we need to address, we'll be happy to do that, because we've been through it, and it may be interesting for you to hear what we have to say, although the following crews are very experienced. They already endured 6-month missions. So thank you for your attention. I think I used up my 4 minutes.
Спасибо. The next question is to Sergei Krikov. Your over 800 days of spaceflight experience is spread over many vehicles. You've had short duration flights, long duration, Soyuz, shuttle, Mir, station. As we look to the 1-year mission on station, how do you think that may equip us for exploration? Given the differences that you have in durations and vehicles, do you have some thoughts on how the 1-year mission might prepare us for exploration in a different type of vehicle?
Спасибо за предоставленное слово. Мне, наверное, хотелось бы вернуться
for the opportunity to speak here today.
Тем временам, про которые сейчас
I would like to say a few words about the days that were described previously by Vladimir Titov. I know that Volkov and Jean-Luc Chrétien did the handover with to help with the handover for the crew that's been there for a year. And I remember that we were told on the ground by the psychologists that the crews that were on board then were very tired, and we had to be very attentive and careful with them. They're overly tired, and they'll probably be irritable with us. And I know that when we arrived on board, I wanted to
Тогда на станции уже находилось 3 человека, нас прилетело еще 3.
Ну
и общий объем, наверное, вот 2 модулей, в которых...
I noticed right away the size of the station. I know there were 3 people there already. There's 3 more coming, and the overall size was pretty small, maybe like our stage. So I know that the conditions back then were pretty hard, pretty tough. But when we arrived on board the station, we saw that the crew that we were replacing were still very fit, very normal. There is nothing unusual going on in terms of psychological effects, at least nothing that we've noticed. I know that my time is limited, so I don't want to spend too much time on every single detail. I just wanted to say that it was very interesting to observe how our approach to long-duration flight has been undergoing changes. I worked with the shuttle flights. I was also working with the ISS because we were looking at the future goals and future plans. And I remember we talked about flight duration, and I was asked what would be the most optimal mission duration in terms of accomplishing as much as possible on board the station. And as Vladimir just mentioned, we tried different durations up to 1 year duration, and we arrived at the decision that 6 months is probably the most optimal time. Based on my previous experience where I stayed on board the station 6 months and 10 months, I can tell you that 6 months is probably the closest to the optimal mission duration. I know that we also had a chance to fly for 3 months to 2.5 months. Those were widely accepted durations, even though I kept saying that 6 months would be better. It was still decided that since we'll do crew rotation using shuttle vehicles, it would be better to keep the durations to this shorter time. But eventually we transitioned to the 6 months missions. And it's actually pretty useful because the station is pretty complex. And when you first arrive, you have to adapt. And getting closer to the 6 month mark, you start getting tired. Your motivation is decreasing maybe. So I think the 6 months duration is therefore probably the most optimal. So eventually, based on all of the above, the decision was made to try a 6 months duration flight, even though it's already been done before by Valery Polyakov, who actually has flown for a year and 2 months. So we did have some statistical data in that regard. But now we had new technologies, new systems that would allow us to monitor what's happening on board. So now is a really good time to try it again, try a long duration flight again. But again, we have to make sure we know why we're doing it. If our sole motivation is to prepare for the interplanetary missions, then I think that we should be looking at a much wider scope of issues other than medical. I know that we have to probably update our training, because when we talk about returning to Earth and we're training the crews to return to Earth, they'll forget a lot of it over the 1 year's time. So you have to keep in mind that some of the information will be forgotten. So we will have to update our equipment, our technology. We will have to update the flight trajectories. We will probably have to update our training to make it more effective and memorable. So if we're looking at several long-duration missions, then we really need to think long and hard in terms of why we're doing it. I know that here we're talking mostly about medical aspects, but I can also see that there are a lot of astronauts or cosmonauts in the audience. So, and I'm sure they would be interested in things other. Thank you.
Spasiba. Dr. Dinges, from a neurobehavioral standpoint, what do you think about the 1 year missions in terms of detecting possible threshold effects, things that kick in after some period of time in a kind of an abrupt way? And how does our experience with long duration terrestrial analogs kind of shape how we're looking at the 1 year missions?
Well, personally, we very much need these 1 year missions, and frankly, even longer. But the missions will allow us to do this first step of this time dependence effect. So are there continuing cumulative effects? And this is not just about the brain and behavior, and that's really what we're talking about. Whenever the word psychology gets used, we're really talking about the brain and the way it monitors its own capability or doesn't monitor it well, and the way it performs and the way it interacts with other brains. But the missions are needed because we know already from 24 astronauts we've tracked on ISS with just some simple measures that there are cumulative effects. We also know that we're still looking for what the threshold effects are, to use those analogies. We haven't yet been testing very many countermeasures, except for the ones already in place that NASA and the Russian space agencies use, which are psychological and psychiatric support for crews in space flight. So we need the longer missions because the one thing we ask crews at the end of every debrief, I always throw in a few spontaneous questions, and one is, the last thing I say is, could you have gone any longer? And I'm astounded at the honesty of most astronauts and people about this. Half of them will say, possibly not. Or no, that was it. I gave it everything I had. I didn't have any fuel in the tank. Now, there are always those who say, sure, how much longer do you want me to go? Most of them, though, add a caveat. Probably I could if I knew my family was okay. Now, this raises another issue. Now, do we think they could have gone longer based on some of the ratings in that? Possibly not. Part of what we don't understand behaviorally is how much of this is the limit of the brain and behavior that differs among people phenotypically of the kind that Dr. Hines talked about relative to radiation. But we see this in demanding performance scenarios, even among high performers. But it's also very much tied with the extent to which they think that conditions will remain stable that hold them psychologically stable. And if they think those props are still available to them and they're going to be okay, they keep going. It's also dependent on their biological reactions to other things going on. If their skin's changing, if they've gotten a high dose of radiation, or if they've noticed that they're muscle wasting, or they're losing muscle mass faster than other crew members, or they're having increased trouble in another medical area, that plays into their sense of whether they can keep going, because they realize motivation alone won't carry me. Remember, we select these people because they're incredible performers already, because they're motivated and willing to take these risks. Their models of themselves have to do with their ability and their training and their motivation. But we're also talking about the brain as a biological organ. It has limits, and they vary among us on when it'll hit the limits. A particular concern to me, and the reason I think the analog environments are so important on Earth, and a particular concern is what we learned from Mars 500, the 520-day mission. Although this has been seen in other analogs, roughly half to 2/3 of people will suffer a significant problem of some kind behaviorally. It'll be a sleep disturbance, sleep-wake timing, sleep quality, insomnia, impulsive behavior, a negative mood state can lead to a depression or conflicts with other individuals, or outright disobedience in the mission. We never talk about this, bad behavior. I won't cooperate, or I'll tell a lie, or I won't do what they asked me to do, or I'll pretend I did it and log it in, but I didn't really do it. Deceptive behavior is an inherent part of all human behavior, and even the most righteous people do it. We all tell lies every day. It's just that you don't want a lie that would compromise a mission or that would cause a catastrophic event. So we know that those things are real. We need these very long analogs on Earth and in spaceflight. But let me just end with this. The real challenge we face here is the one-year mission won't be enough for me, because the very things that affect human behavior and the brain for exploration mission are not simulated in the one-year mission. Even if you went around the Earth for 10 years, you're still orbiting Earth. You still see the planet. You take pictures, you smile, you wave, you're on TV, you call your spouse, you call your friends, you're on the 6 o'clock news. That's not exploration. Say goodbye to Earth. Say goodbye to your family. Say goodbye to real-time communication. Say goodbye to real-time psychological support. What we have to do behaviorally is at the magnitude level of what the radiation people have to do. We have to figure out how to take care of you when we're not around to take care of you. We have to figure out how to get you there and get you back, get the mission accomplished, and do it safely. That's our real challenge. So I think Earth analogs play an incredibly important role regardless of the one-year missions. I don't think we're done learning from Earth analogs. It's just that ultimately, I would love to see the ISS used as a full-scale simulation of exploration, where periods where there is communication delay, just exactly as IBMP did with Mars 520. We learned a great deal. We learned about impulsive behavior. We learned about conflicts. We learned who mission controllers didn't like. And by the way, that's not necessarily the worst cosmonaut. That could be a very effective, behaviorally stable astronaut. This is not a blame game or a responsibility game. It's how people behave. So I'll stop right there after that stunning claim. We need even more radical missions, and see what you think.
Thank you, David, for that thought-provoking challenge. Dr. Bogomolov, what medical aspects of the one-year mission are you most interested in, especially in light of the previous greater than one-year missions on Mir?
I would like to say that the ISS program allowed to create several groups, including the group that studies risks, human risks. And I know that there were tests or studies done for risks that are not allowed during the interplanetary or deep space exploration. It was very useful, and it showed us that there were a lot of aspects, there were a lot of areas that were beyond the scope of our understanding. The orbital missions that we have done to date is covered by our knowledge base and the tools that we have, and we're able to maintain safety and overall well-being of the crews. And that was the basis for extending mission duration and studying new risks that may be associated with these long durations. For example, the risks of vision impairment due to intracranial pressure, something that we haven't seen in the past. We have new tools, more advanced tools for studying that. I think that a year-long mission is partially a repeat of what already been done, but it's also a new test bed or test facility, test laboratory that would allow us to create new research. And part of this research is going to be done in cooperation with our U.S. colleagues, where the U.S. and Russia is going to be conducting joint experiments. There will be some crossover studies where astronauts will be participating in Russian experiments and cosmonauts will be participating in the U.S. research. We would like to create a new database that would allow us to do the information exchange, result exchange. There is an issue of standardization of our methodology for evaluating risks and prevention measures. So I think during the one-year mission, we will be able to see some trends that would allow us to move towards standardization. In terms of medicine, then medical research and science research are growing closer together during this TAP mission. one-year mission is important because the crews that will be participating in the one-year mission have previous experience of shorter missions, so we can compare the results and the effects, those durations. The U.S. astronaut has a twin brother, so it will be very interesting to do research on impact of the longer duration mission on him as compared to what's happening to his brother here on Earth. So this new mission will allow us to create a better database and allow for new opportunities. Thank you.
Спасибо. Similarly, Dr. Kozlovskaya, how do you look at what we can learn about the physiology and the effectiveness of countermeasures in the ISS one-year mission or missions, multiple missions, and compared to what we have learned from the Mir missions?
Ну, я думаю, что на самом деле
I think
плохо, когда мы сделаем что-то.
It's not good when we do something, then stop doing it for a very long time, and then many years later go back to the initial issue and do things all over again. And this is exactly what we lost in this particular case, or this is our loss in this case. And Sergei was very correct in saying that when we were planning a year-long mission in the 80s, back then, this mission was specifically targeted to define limits for human stay in space, and also to define various tools and methodologies that allow us to accomplish that. And now we've progressed quite a bit in terms of technology and so forth. But I started working in the area of space medicine so long ago, back in '78. And back then, mission duration for the first crew that I worked with was 140 days. And then in the 80s, Manarov and Titov went to space for 1 year. But between the two of them, they already had 2 flights with a duration of 175, 125, 211, and other durations. So all of that over the 10-year period. So by the time we got to 1-year mission, we had quite a bit of statistical data and quite a bit of knowledge. So we had very specific hypotheses that we wanted to test. But I think right now we're losing sight of one thing. The Russian countermeasures system and medical support was developing in such a way that you would never have anything on board that hasn't been extensively tested here on the ground. And I remember we had 1-year-long bed rest experiment, the sole purpose of which back then was to resolve a number of issues that were brought to our attention by long-duration flights. We wanted to see what countermeasures we could develop. And back then, we already had quite a few countermeasures. But we wanted to know what would be the most optimal way for monitoring human state. I know that we had veloergometer. We knew that we need to monitor locomotive system or function. And prior to the actual mission, we conducted a year-long ground experiment that addressed all the same issues that we wanted to study during the actual mission. And we worked with 12 volunteers. And the protocols, test protocols, were developed in such a way that we were able to divide our test subjects
предлагаемые и уже используемые 8 различных мер профилактики.
They could evaluate 8 different countermeasures, tools, or systems. Moreover, we developed different monitoring systems for monitoring crew health or test subject tests.
Но такие вопросы как: возможно ли перерывы в ходе полета? Ведь в ходе годичного полета
We wanted to know whether or not we could have breaks in physical activity during the one-year mission. For example, if somebody falls sick and can't do any physical exercising. And we wanted to know how such breaks will affect landings. Also, we wanted to know whether or not we can restore in flight muscle tone and muscle function.
And we are not working in that direction right now, and it is necessary. And we do have people, we do have scientists in our field that are absolutely sure that in space we are usually losing locomotive functions. But we are able actually to support it somehow, but we would not be able to increase locomotive function in space. And that means that if a person lost something due to a 1 month break, then I'm sorry, you will not be able to bring it to the same level, necessary level anymore. All of that has been verified in a 1-year bed rest analog, that we actually are able to have some breaks. We are able to move from one countermeasure to another countermeasure. And we had some rehab systems and methods and assets. We already did have a system before we started flying. That is why when we started flying for 1 year, for us, 1 year flight was something to conclude and to prove what we have already tested in analogs. They were testing and verifying the results that the 12 volunteers were showing us on the ground. Right now, we have a different situation. We are going to have 2 people in space. The questions for them, I don't want people to be upset with me. I know it is difficult to prepare for such a mission and to select the priorities and select the tasks the necessary that would actually be, that we will attempt to resolve. Until now, we, people who work with cosmonauts, and people who are going to train them, who are going to monitor them in flight, we still do not have, we don't know what those priorities are going to be. I don't know whether the cosmonauts are aware of the priorities, and I'm concerned with that. And I think that this mission with our 2 heroes will be remarkable, and it needs to be only if it is going to become a beginning of a large activity in that direction that is absolutely necessary. If this is a beginning, then yes, we are ready and we can start. But if we are just going to just have it one time, no, we're not ready yet. And thank you for listening to me.
Спасибо. Dr. Scott, I've been given the word that we're into the afternoon already, so if you can tighten it up even more. But Dr. Bogomolov already alluded to a unique aspect of the 1-year mission, namely the twin aspect. Could you inform us, please, about that?
Exactly, and so NASA is flying a twin, and twins have been studied by scientists for arguably 200 years, if not longer. We like to use twins to try to tease apart nature versus nurture. So this created a bolt-on opportunity for the one-year mission, the opportunity for NASA and NSBRI to initiate a pilot demonstration project. And actually this was at the suggestion of Mark and Scott Kelly, who said, hey, we're twins, what can we work with that? Can we do something with that? And I think it's very exciting. And so we wrote a solicitation. We had a very robust response from the community, in fact, including people like Mike Schneider, who have never done any space biomedical research, but he's an expert practitioner in the field of omics. And so people like this really came into the fold. They wrote solicitations, and in fact, Dr. Schneider was one of the people selected. There were 10 investigators selected. We have brought them together and teamed them because we're going to be splaying across the whole central dogma, looking at the DNA, the RNA, the proteins, and beyond, looking at this exciting new area of epigenomics, looking at the metabolites, looking at the bacteria that are living in the gut. So it's a very sexy experiment, to be honest. It's a first experiment. And we will learn a lot scientifically. We will also learn some things on the ethical side. There are concerns certainly within NASA about privacy, about how could this affect my flight status, how could this affect my family members. And so we're wrestling with all of those problems and coming up with solutions. So it won't just be scientifically that we will learn things. We will learn things from an ethical and a pragmatic point of view about how to proceed with these omics studies. I think they're very important because I think the challenges are so tremendous to get to Mars that we have to throw the full weight of 21st century medicine at these types of challenges. And so my hope is that this pilot demonstration project, much like Mercury led to Gemini, which led to Apollo, will lead to more ambitious projects, again, as we solve the scientific problems and the ethical concerns. And so what we may see, I hope, following on from the twin study, are studies where perhaps we look at cohorts of astronauts that are on the ground versus cohorts of astronauts that are in space. And how could this be coupled with one-year missions, future one-year missions? Well, I think that it seems at least reasonable that if you're wanting to interrogate what space radiation, for example, is doing, the longer that you actually have an astronaut in the environment where they're experiencing space radiation, the more likely it will be that you will see something in the genome or the transcriptome or the proteome. So I think that I will close there, and just to say that this, we're very excited about this study, and I think it's going to give us a whole lot of leads as to how to move forward in this really rich area of omics. So, Craig, I hope I tightened that up enough for you.
Yes, thank you very much, Graham. It's a very tantalizing area. So, for the final word, Mr. Gerstenmaier, would you please comment on, from your vantage point, the significance of the upcoming one-year mission that we're working towards right now and the possible role of future one-year missions?
Okay. First of all, I think that this is a tremendous opportunity for us all to look at space research in kind of a new way. And I know that in the past, the Russians had the methodical approach of kind of increasing duration methodically and moving forward. But this kind of now resets this community to go back and look at what we're trying to do. And our ultimate goal is really to get us ready for Mars. So there's no question in my mind why we're doing this. It's to look for the Mars kind of activities, to make sure that things you talked about at the beginning, Craig, the time dependence of risk, the countermeasure efficiency, the cumulative effects of risks, if any of those really change dramatically from our experience base of 6 months to 1 year, those could be critical. Learning those now as we prepare for Mars and start thinking about Mars could be the most important data we ever learn moving forward. And we have data from before that says that there's not a problem, but this is a chance for us to kind of look at it more systematically and work better as a team. And the other thing I've seen out of this is we've had tremendous support and tremendous international cooperation on building the protocols for this mission. Because it's a little different than the 6 months, some of the existing 6-month protocols no longer were relevant, so they had to build a new protocol. And it wasn't a US protocol, it wasn't a Russian protocol, it was now a combined protocol. So to see this team work together has been really effective. The things we're doing now with post-landing, where we do the crews do the sit and lay down and stand up tests immediately after Soyuz launch or landings, has tremendous data that we're getting forward. So there's real benefits to this one-year mission from that perspective. I also think we need to think about, how many more of these missions we want to go do. It's clear from the discussion here, I think the community would like to do more of these, but the problem is if you do these missions, it's going to cut down on the sample size of astronauts that we have available in the environment of space. So just like everything, there's a positive of this and there's a negative aspect of this. So I think at this point where I kind of sit, and we'll look to the community to see what they learn from this activity as they prepare and see how it actually occurs in flight. And then based on the data that we get from this flight, we'll determine whether we want to do more of these. And it's worth the loss potentially in some of the data samples that we get. So we'll see how it goes forward, and really looking forward to this. I think this is truly unique in many ways. It really ties us clearly to Mars. It shows how station can be used. We need to look at the ground aspects, as was discussed here, more to make sure we don't miss something there. But there's a tremendous advantage of this. It's curious when you talked about doing more Mars simulations on station and removing Earth views and removing time and other things, or putting time delays into conversations. The comments I get back from the crews are, yeah, we'll do that when we go to Mars, but we don't necessarily want to do that on space station. So you need to answer that question and talk to my crew members, and then when you get an answer, you can tell me, and we can go support some more simulations on station that mimic Mars. So that's it. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much. It's afternoon, but I have permission to entertain a few questions. So please, I still think we should go for 2.5 hours, but that's not going to happen. Yes. David Longnecker.
Yes, I'm wondering, let's assume we get these omics data, and how do we separate out whether this is something to do with space or space radiation, or is it something that's, for example, seen in other isolated, confined micro-societies? Perhaps submariners, or some, obviously when we think about mountaineering or whatever, that's pretty short term, but there are other environments like that. Maybe it's Antarctica, I don't know. But how do we separate these findings between the two possible causes, at least,
if I may piggyback on that, because my question is almost the same. Has there been any plans to simulate conditions being restricted in space, in activities, and access to family for the ground crew member versus the twin in flight? In other words, it would get to just that point. If you really want to know what's the space environment part of this, are the conditions of living on ISS going to be replicated for the twin on the ground?
Graham?
So I'll be brief. So Mark Kelly, in general, will live his normal life during the 12 months. This is a pilot demonstration project. It is not a perfect experiment, just to be clear about that. He will entertain for certain experiments, potentially for limited time frames, mirroring his activities to Scott, but that would be for very limited time periods. So in general, he's going to live his normal life for that 1 year. The first question, how do you tease apart radiation versus microgravity versus close confinement? The honest answer is with great difficulty, but you have to start somewhere. And one thing you can look to is the literature in terms of model organisms. There is a decent body of literature around radiation with model organisms, and the nice things about genes is they tend to be fairly well conserved. So we can make a start. We cannot probably draw definitive conclusions from this study, but we can make a start, and we can borrow and look at the literature in terms of the model organisms, particularly vis-a-vis radiation of rodents and other organisms, and look and see if we're seeing those types of phenomena in the humans as well. And then we move on with the data that we have and the new questions that we have to generate new studies. Pilot demonstration project.
One more question? Jay. Jay Bucky, please.
So in the past, it would seem like the goal of the longer missions was to validate the countermeasure project and to show that you could keep people in space for that period of time. Since that's been shown, are there other sort of more detailed goals for this one-year mission? Do you want to show that you can bring people back without any bone loss? Are you trying to set the muscle loss at a particular place? Are you setting any performance criteria that people should be expected to meet when they come back? Are there any sort of more detailed goals rather than just completing a year in space?
Ваш вопрос совершенно справедлив, потому что
Question.
даже сейчас, когда летают наши
Even now,
экипажи на
when our
станции,
crews
мы
are
имеем
in mission,
для двух коллективов разные системы профилактики.
for two communities, we have two systems of countermeasures, and it is not just different in detail. The countermeasures are different that are based on different principles. The only thing in common is the time that is provided for physical exercise, and I will say that's it. Nothing else is in common. Until now, we've been flying together. It's almost 15 years on the station, and the systems are different. And we do not see a way how to answer the question which system is more effective. I wouldn't say even more effective. They are both successful because people come back alive and capable of living normal lives. But the cost is different. Also, executability is different. Manpower, everything. If you look at it in detail, the effects are different also. So it would be natural to know that in this one-year flight, when we have two crew members that will be, I'm sure, using the system to full capacity, we will have an ability to compare the effectiveness of these two countermeasure systems that are being used on board. But for that, we need to have a single system of assessment. We have to have the same criteria. We don't have that, and that bothers me. I think your question was great. It was just ready for me. This is what is a concern of mine. This is what we are fighting for right now, for common criteria, for common assessment methods.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking the panel for sharing their insights and expertise. I still maintain we should have gone for 2.5 hours, but